Good afternoon, everyone. International law has long been seen as the foundation of global peace, built to uphold sovereignty, prevent conflicts, and ensure collective security. But this ideal has rarely been applied universally. From its inception, the rules-based international order was shaped by the victors and architects of World War II, reflecting their interests rather than global consensus. To illustrate this, John Dugard highlights in today's readings that Western powers often use the RBO more as a political tool distinct from international law, raising concerns about its universality. Similarly, Thea Roberts emphasizes how interpretations of international law may vary across regions and are influenced by local power dynamics. This brings us to some critical questions. Does international law still hold the potential to function as a framework for justice in an increasingly multipolar world? And perhaps more importantly, can the rules-based international order adapt and survive in an era defined by competing centers of power? In today's presentation, we'll address these questions by exploring the historical foundations of the rules-based international order, how multipolarity is on the rise, and after that, we will go over some specific cases like the war in Gaza and in Ukraine. Let's begin by understanding where the rules-based order started. The rules-based order emerged after World War II to promote peace through legal norms and institutions. It was built on four key pillars. First, the UN Charter enshrined principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity, prohibiting the use of force under Article 2. However, its effectiveness was often undermined by the Security Council's veto power, which paralyzed collective security mechanisms. Complementing this framework was the adoption of the Geneva Conventions, which codified humanitarian protections during conflict. Yet, compliance by states was often very inconsistent, undermining their impact. Thirdly, economic stability was addressed through the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, and these, however, concentrated decision-making power in Western states, exposing structural inequalities. Finally, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights envisioned global equality, but nonetheless, its lack of binding legal force left it vulnerable to political priorities. Despite these efforts, Cold War realities exposed significant limitations, as we can see here on this chart. Soviet Union, Russian Federation, and United States vetoed a lot of times in the Security Council, and this highlights the challenges of achieving consistent enforcement. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, the United States emerged as a sole superpower. This period was seen as a victory of liberal democracy and international law. However, the absence of a rival power exposed some severe contradictions. For instance, the US wielded unparalleled influence over international institutions. As Krish and Dugard point out, the United States selectively applied international law to justify interventions in cases like Libya, Kosovo, and Iraq. And in these cases, the United States and some allies of NATO sidestepped the UN Charter's prohibition on the use of force under Article 2, subsection 4. By 2008, the cracks in the rules-based international order were undeniable. The global financial crisis highlighted economic vulnerabilities and paved the way for multipolarity and further fragmentation. As US dominance declined, power was being more dispersed across multiple centers. This shift fractured the legal order, with key players like China and Russia challenging established norms. Let's start with China's role. The South China Sea has become a flashpoint for the erosion of international maritime law. In 2016, the Permanent Court of Arbitration ruled against China's territorial claims under the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea. However, Beijing rejected the ruling and continued militarizing artificial islands. This defiance, as Roberts notes, reflects a divisible college of legal traditions where differing agendas shape interpretations of international law in various ways. Meanwhile, under the One China policy, Taiwan is not recognized as a sovereign state by most countries, and of course not by China itself. As multipolar tensions between China and the US intensify, and probably the next month they will only get worse, and they will intensify even more with Trump's next administration, Taiwan becomes and will become a critical test for the limits of international law in managing sovereignty disputes. On the other hand, we have the Belt and Road Initiative. And yeah, by structuring bilateral agreements with over 140 countries, this Belt and Road Initiative, launched by Xi Jinping a couple of years ago, is basically bypassing a lot of multilateral frameworks like the World Trade Organization, and it raises a lot of concerns about sovereignty and coercive diplomacy. The Belt and Road Initiative success relies on leveraging economic dependency, often sidelining established international legal norms in favor of power-based relationships. As you can see here on the map, China is building its influence a lot in the global south, but also on some very geostrategic locations, as here in the Red Sea and around the Middle East. And these are all maritime routes that are super important, especially for maritime trade, containers, oil reserves, gas reserves, that are all coming from this area, especially under the Indo-China corridor, very geostrategic location. Here in Sri Lanka, it bought over a port. Also, it's tremendously investing in places and ports infrastructure in Djibouti, Ethiopia as well, and it's forming the new Silk Roads, which Jonathan Halstead, China expert, really alludes to as the new China Silk Road trap, actually. And also in Pakistan, it's building a lot of infrastructure as well. So this is one of the main reasons why the United States sees this more as a bigger threat for the rest of the 21st century than what's happening on the European continent, because this is involving the whole Indo-Pacific. And China is also trying to fill up the power vacuum in Africa that the European former colonizers left behind. So a lot of things are at stake. Also, if we look here at the 9-dash line is around these coordinates. And China is trying to influence this area more and more and more. It sees it as its own sovereign part of the Pacific. And right now, there are a lot of contested islands by the Philippines, by South Korea, Japan. China sees this as their territory. But there is a kind of an undisclosed theory that is being only launched by a former Chinese general. And it's about the islands chain strategy. This should be, the 9-dash line should be the first island chain. If China wants to expand its influence even more on the Pacific, the second island chain will be around Guam, where US military presence is very obvious. The third one will be around Hawaii, and Hawaii, Fiji in the south. So China believes, because it had already expanded a lot of its power, it's the second largest economy in the world, it believes it should also have the rights to get a fair share of the Pacific. So this is only increasing multipolar tensions. Next, let's turn to Russia. Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 blatantly violated Article 2 of the UN Charter as well. And this mirrors justification used by Western states in past interventions. Professor Labuda further highlights that while RBO institutions sought to universalize norms, the Russia-Ukrainian war exposes how regional interpretations, shaped by historical, economic, and political context, fragment the system and challenge the universality of international law. What's more is that in 2016, Russia and China's joint declaration highlighted their vision of a multipolar world, emphasizing principles like sovereign equality and non-intervention, which are up for interpretation. This illustrates how multipolarity complicates accountability as powerful states shield themselves from legal consequences. Finally, let's examine how other powers navigate multipolarity. In 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran reached a détente mediated by China, bypassing Western frameworks. At the same time, Yemen's ongoing conflict highlights a lack of accountability for humanitarian violations. India, on the other hand, maintains strategic autonomy, balancing relations with both the US, China, and Russia. And for example, China is the biggest importer of arms in the world. And almost 50% of its arms are imported from Russia, despite global sanctions. To illustrate these challenges even further, let's look at two key contemporary studies, Ukraine and Gaza. As we've discussed earlier, Russia's invasion of Ukraine represents a textbook violation of international law. This invasion has also prompted ICC investigations into war crimes. However, enforcement remains limited as Russia rejects ICC jurisdiction and leverages its power in the Security Council. Brunk and Hakimi warned that the erosion of annexation prohibitions risks normalizing such violations of a global scale, further undermine the universality of international law. So as we can see here, the United Nations General Assembly resolution, it happened right after the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. This was done in March 2022. It was a voting procedure, and we can see a lot of abstinence, especially from Asian countries, African countries, and they're getting more and more skeptical. They want to keep out of the great power politics. So this is a new trend that is making the world more multipolar. If we move on to the Middle East, where the conflict in Gaza exposes a lot of fragility in international humanitarian law, the violations of proportionality, civilian protections under Geneva Conventions are widespread. In most recent news, the ICJ's advisory opinion on Israel's occupation on Palestinian territories reinforces the absolute prohibition of annexation, highlighted by Brunk and Hakimi. The court made it clear that Israel's actions violate international norms and threaten the principle of self-determination. What's perhaps more striking and more troubling is the stark contrast in the international response to Ukraine and Gaza. Critiques by Professor Labuda and Kowan highlight Western double standards, with proactive responses to Ukraine but ambivalence in Gaza, where, for instance, US vetoes hindered a lot of ceasefire resolutions. Such inconsistencies erode trust in international law's credibility and universality. So let's ask ourselves, where does this leave international law in a multipolar world? As we stand at a crossroads in this evolution, it is clear that the challenges of a multipolar world go beyond just geopolitical competition. Fragmentation into regional systems, such as the BRICS and the African Union and ASEAN, reflect dissatisfaction with Western-dominated frameworks, while global institutions like the UN Security Council and the ICC face declining trust due to limited enforcement and perhaps geopolitical paralysis, as we can see in Gaza and Ukraine. On the other hand, multipolarity creates opportunities for reform, expanding and reforming Security Council's membership, reducing veto power, and also integrating regional mechanisms could enhance accountability and complement global frameworks. The question remains, can international law adapt, or will it devolve into a tool for greater powers? The answer is somewhere in the middle. International law has always reflected power dynamics, balancing legal principles and geopolitical influence. Despite its flaws, its vision of a world governed by rules rather than raw power remains a beacon of hope. Its future hinges on the global community's commitment to justice over dominance and cooperation over competition. In the words of former UN Secretary General Hammarskjöld, the United Nations was not created to bring us to heaven, but to save us from hell. The same applies to international law. Its future lies not in its perfection, but in its perseverance. Will we use this moment of transition to build and to rebuild a system that serves humanity? Or will we let international law become a relic of the past? The choice is ours. Thank you.